Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you to our Career Development webinar presented by National Research Mentoring Network. And today, our topic is protecting yourself and others from stereotype threats. We have very esteemed presenters, Dr. Michelle Van Ryn and Dr. Sean Phelan of Partners in Equity and Inclusion, as well as the Mayo Clinic. Thank you very much for being here. At this time, we'd like to turn it over to our presenters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to start with a couple of little pieces of information, assuming I can advance the slides. Hold on a sec. Perfect. So I want to say a little bit about our roles because it can be confusing. So about a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago, a group of us developed a nonprofit organization called Partners in Equity and Inclusion, and you can find us on a website. We also conduct research at Mayo Clinic through the research program on equity and inclusion in healthcare. So all of our intervention, talks, educational activities run through Partners in Equity and Inclusion, and all of our scientific research activities occur as part of our role at Mayo Clinic, which has been a fabulous supporter for this kind of work. So Mayo Clinic is providing the technical equipment and, of course, our time for the webcast. Other than that, everything here has been developed or provided by Partners in Equity and Inclusion. The references are extensive, so we've provided a link. It's here. It will also be on the last page, and I understand that this is going to be accessible, so don't worry about it if you don't have time to jot that down super quick. Before we start, I'm going to ask everybody who's listening to do something a little bit different, and it will become clear later why we're asking. What I'd like to ask all of you, and I really hope that you will do this, is take 30 seconds to focus on your core, deep values, the values that bring you to this webinar, the values that you bring to your work. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Sean Phelan. I would like to say that if people at any time during this webinar find themselves getting at all tense or distracted, to come back and just take a moment and really let your attention be filled by your core values, the things that are of deepest importance to you. So.
Well, hello, everybody. It's really nice to have a chance to present to so wide an audience. I wish I could see faces, but that's not possible, I guess. Our objectives here are to really kind of give a fairly thorough kind of review of the state of the research on social identity or stereotype threat, but then, probably more importantly, talk about how that research, how that science kind of interacts with our daily lives and the way that we communicate with people and the relationships we have with people. So moving on, start with a quick, quick background about identity. We have a number of social identities. They are the various things that make up our sense of self, how we see ourselves, and how we think we are being seen by other people. They can include our culture and subcultures, the groups that we feel we belong to, our demographic characteristics, age, race, sexual orientation, things about our appearance, all the various identities that we kind of take on and feel that we represent as we move through the world. Now, social identity threat is what happens when one of those identities is at risk of being devalued. So identities are, some of them have kind of positive connotations to us, some of them more negative connotations to us, some of them give a sense of strength, others not so much. But regardless, they're central to our self-esteem because it's how we see ourselves and how we believe that other people see us. And so because of that, we're motivated to protect them. And so these identities are important to us. And importantly, the specific social identity that is pertinent or salient in a situation is not always our choice. We may get strength from or feel most comfortable seeing ourselves as a scholar or a parent or whatever, whatever the identity is that we would, choose to or tend to see ourselves in, but that's not always the way that we're being perceived by other people.
As a clarifying point, the devaluing of some of our identities is not because those identities are not valuable. They are valuable. So this is one of the ways that societal stereotypes and things that have perpetuated oppression can get under our skin. So when Sean was talking about desirable or undesirable, he wasn't talking at all and didn't intend to be talking about objective truth, but more societal stereotypes or cultural stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So social identity threat or stereotype threat, when something in a situation cues a group identity, whatever that group identity is, and cues our awareness of group stereotypes of that identity, we can experience the detrimental effects of identity threat. One important thing to keep in mind is that there's no identity threat doesn't involve a value that you placed on the identity. It's not the same thing as internalized stigma. You don't have to believe that the stereotype about this group that you feel you're a member of is true. You just have to be aware that other people might believe it's true and might be seeing you in that way. So what are some of the, we've got to kind of get into it. There's no better way than examples, I think, to talk about what stereotype threat is. So what are some of the ways that stereotype threat kind of manifests itself and affects us? A few examples from the scientific literature. In one study by Danaher and Crandall, they looked at the placement of the question about what is your gender on an AP math test. And they estimated, based on their findings, that 4,700 more girls every year would receive AP calculus credit if they were asked what their gender was at the end of the test instead of at the beginning. So the simple fact of cueing that identity and potentially stereotypes related to that identity about math ability had that strong of an effect. Men and social sensitivity. In one study, men did worst on a test that assesses accuracy of interpreting other people's nonverbal behavior when they were told it was a test of social sensitivity, something that's not sort of stereotypically a characteristic of men, than when they were told it was a test of information processing. Girls in chess. When female chess players believed that the opponent they were playing was male, they performed worse than male chess players playing male opponents. But when they were told that they were playing against another female player, they performed as well as male players. This is an interesting example because it kind of moves into physical ability, a little bit out of kind of intellectual ability, that stereotypes relevant to physical accomplishments or physical ability are affected or can have an effect as well. In this study, white golfers did worse than black golfers when they were told they were taking a test of natural athletic ability, but black golfers did worse than white golfers when told the test required sports strategic intelligence. And finally, in some of the most, I'd say replicated and kind of original examples or studies demonstrating stereotype threat, black test takers performed worse than white test takers when told that they were taking a test of intelligence. But when told that it was a lab task or some other exercise that didn't indicate intellectual ability, the disparity in performance was eliminated. And there's several additional examples that you could go into, and if there's time, hundreds of examples. Yeah, I'm not sure about time, so we won't go into them specifically right now, but could always come back to them if we need to. So what's going on? Well, there's a series, sort of a cascade of events that happens when we become aware that we might be seen in terms of a group stereotype. And some of those occurrences are conscious and some of them are unconscious. So the unconscious one is primarily the stress response, right? It's stressful to feel these things, to feel like you're being seen in a stereotypical way. You have the whole sort of hormonal response to stress that saps up cognitive ability. It gives you that, sort of the maybe a little bit of sweating, the increased heart rate, the things that kind of stand in the way of communication and performance. We take time and effort to try to control those emotions. We try to suppress those thoughts and return to, whatever it is at hand that we want to do. We become vigilant and distracted for evidence of being treated in stereotype consistent ways. There's a certain degree of pressure to represent that social group that you're being seen in terms of, and then just again the stress response, the cognitive, the conscious anxiety, and all those things sort of add up together to result in a de-skilling effect. Because we spend so much of our cognitive resources, so much of our energy dealing with these effects, we're often de-skilled in a way that can actually confirm or in some ways kind of demonstrate the stereotype in action. And so a lot of times it causes behavior to be consistent with stereotypes. So there's one specific type of stereotype threat that I think we'd like to point out, because I think it's something that's kind of stood in the way of a lot of efforts to improve kind of diversity climate in organizations, and that's the underestimating or not giving value or credence to the threat that comes with being stereotyped as a majority member who is in power and exercising that power, I guess. The stereotype of being a white racist or male sexist, that the anxiety associated with that threat also has the same kind of stereotype threat effects that can, frankly, turn people off to dealing with these issues because it often doesn't feel good. I mean, most people don't want to be thought of in that way, and can also lead to things like physical distancing, fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, things that can come across as dislike or disinterest in the topic. So we think it's an important part of the stereotype threat process that people don't focus on very much.
I want to just add a piece, and that is that when underrepresented minorities, women, and so on experience stereotype threat in an organization, it's harmful to them. When whites, like me, I'm white, and other majority group members experience stereotype threat, it's harmful to underrepresented minorities, women, and other stigmatized populations. So it plays out in a different way. The great thing, though, is that if you emphasize learning from interactions, the negative white racist stereotype threat seems to be diminished. So, okay, and back to Sean.
Yeah. So actually, some applications of this for what this means for college students and mentees. Were you going to take that over, Michelle?
Sure. Okay. So some of you may, as you listen to this, be very familiar with this already. Some of you may have never heard much about this, but hopefully some of you are understanding some of the experiences you've had in a different way. So one of the problems that occurs with stereotype threat is it can occur without us knowing that's what's happening, right? And it has a lot of negative effects that then we're left trying to figure out the cause of. So for example, for the longest time, I didn't understand why it was that when I would join leadership groups that were primarily white men, I would suddenly become very inarticulate, right? And have trouble thinking. And it really reinforced for me low self-efficacy or low self-esteem. So I was reinforcing the stereotype, but it was also affecting my own sense of myself. So I think it's really important to be aware that these effects, when they occur, do not have anything to do with actual ability, but it might be due to stereotype threat. And that alone has been shown to be quite helpful. So when we're experiencing stereotype threat in a workplace or learning environment, or really any other environment, we tend to anticipate that poor performance over time based on past experience. It may cause us to have lower motivation, a lower sense or disassociation from a professional identity, lower career aspirations. It causes people to seek fewer leadership roles and makes us less likely to speak up. And there's a few pieces of this, but one piece that's going on there is that whether we know this is what's happening or not, it's stressful, and we as human beings avoid situations that are stressful. So stereotype threat has both direct effects in the moment, but maybe long-term effects in terms of our choices. So those of you who might be thinking an academic career or other career is too stressful, some of it might be stereotype threat, and some of what we're going to tell you today might help. That's our hope. So the issue here is that it kind of intersects with actual bias, right? So there's both stereotype threat, which is fear of being devalued, and in fact the actual reality that people in some groups are being devalued or stereotyped, and we know this is true. So stereotype threat sometimes is accurate. So the connection there is then we're going to fear performance evaluation. We're less likely to seek feedback on performance, maybe because of an interaction of stereotype threat and then the fact that, let's say, racism does affect performance evaluations. It affects job satisfaction. And then we're a lot likely to recommend to others who are like us to work in the field because we're aware of how stressful it is. And this may be part of what's being implicated. You know, we don't know for sure, but it may be part of the cause of the reduced number of Black men going into medicine, possibly. Long-term effects, disengagement and disidentification. If a situation makes us feel crappy about ourselves, whether we know why or not, we tend to try to seek something else and we disengage from that field. And it's really a heartbreaking loss, I would say, to research, to healthcare, to see people disengage and disidentify. I'm going to go over this super quickly because it's also overlaps with the research on perceived discrimination. You know, repeated and stress exposures have a whole cascade of negative effects that Sean mentioned before. It causes wear and tear, so it can make those people who are experiencing a lot of stereotype threat more exhausted and have a constant sense of threat that can affect inflammation processes. So it's not just performance, it's long-term effects on health potentially. The thing about stereotype threat or social identity threat, those terms are used interchangeably, we go back and forth, is that everyone has at least one group identity that's stereotyped. And Rothenberger and Woolcipher have a great quote in that they say that it's indiscriminate in cursing any group for which a negative stereotype applies. And it does so across a range of domains. And by that, they mean physical activity, interpersonal skills, intellectual tasks, problem-solving tasks. And then they go on to say what is so striking and debilitating about the phenomena is how easily stereotype threat can be activated. So I'm going to turn this back over to Sean. On some of the strategies that people, oh no, is that still me?
Either one?
Okay, sorry. We've done this together in a lot of different ways, and sometimes we trade off in different ways. Okay, so I'll continue with this part for a minute. So the research on stereotype threat is far from complete. And what we know from that research is that there are strategies that people can try that will often work. And so what we do in Partners in Equity and Inclusion is our goal is to make sure that efforts that are out there are informed by the most recent and current evidence, but we don't claim that we have absolute facts. So here are some strategies that we would encourage for you. And that is identify your own stereotype threat triggers. So for example, I named one. One of my triggers is if I'm in a room in which there are few women, few minorities, and it's primarily dominated by white men. That's my issue. So I'm aware of that. There are others, and you will have others as well. Also, notice cues in your environment that might subtly affect your self-concept. So, for example, I pay attention to what the artwork is. And if the artwork is primarily white males, if those are the images on the wall, I'm aware that it might be outside of my conscious awareness affecting my self-concept, and I'll take action. So if you're listening and you're part of an underrepresented minority group and all of the images of leaders around you are white, it may also be subtly affecting your self-concept in that setting. And we may not even be aware of it, right? That's the point. So you want to make sure you're aware of it. And some of that is monitoring yourself. So you can monitor your own physical responses, your own emotional responses, and monitoring subtle changes in your sense of yourself and your competence. Notice cues from others. And then some of the trick here is body sensations and subtle shifts. So when you're faced with a situation with the potential stereotype threat trigger, or a situation you know is going to trigger you, there are a few strategies that have been shown to be effective that you can try. And one of the ones is the exercise we did very briefly at the very beginning of this webinar. Some of the research suggests that focusing on your personal, unique characteristics, skills, and values that are important to yourself, that are important to you, can buffer us from stereotype threat or bring us back to our core selves if we're experiencing it. Ideally, if you know you're going into a setting that may trigger stereotype threat for you, jot them down and maybe why they're important. That really brings them to the core. Anytime that things seem to be going south for you, try to take a moment and let your attention be filled with your core values. Now, I'm going to say that we don't exactly know why this works. There's a lot of different thoughts about this, but I will say that my primary hypothesis, which has not been tested, is that we have a lot of identities. And when we focus on our core values, it brings us back to our core identity. And it allows us to be defined the way we want to be defined versus being defined by societal stereotypes or devaluing.
And I'd add that this is probably the strategy for which there's the most evidence supporting it. And importantly, I think for the, maybe for the people listening to this, is that a lot of the research has been done in educational settings with students who take regular over regular intervals take some time to write these things and have kind of long-term protection against some of the aggregated detrimental effects of stereotype threat. And the other thing is we use the language of social identity or stereotype threat, but really this is, I think, advice that we give people, especially in a mentoring situation or a mentoring relationship, is to keep sight on, keep sight of why you're there. What drove you to the the place that you are, and what is it what's really important to you. I think it's just a universal message, and so it makes a lot of sense outside of the research on stereotype threat.
We don't want to lose you. So here's something that's a little controversial now. We're putting it out there. So there's both studies showing that this works, and then someone replicated it and maybe didn't replicate it in the same way and said it doesn't work. But I would encourage you to try it. It works for me either because it's a placebo effect or because it works for me. But there are some studies showing that your body posture communicates with you, that your self-esteem affects your body posture, but the opposite is true as well. So using postures that communicate confidence can actually improve our sense of confidence and performance. The reason that we report on this, even though we will say that there is some controversy about the evidence, is that it's really consistent with some work that's being done in other fields. So athletes know this well. Athletes know that if they hold themselves and in a confident way and in a strong way, that they will perform better. So this is something you can try. So I mentioned before this, and Sean mentioned before actually, that we all have multiple identities. You all have multiple identities. Some of those identities will be connected to very positive stereotypes. When you're going into a situation, it may be helpful to you to bring to mind and focus on an identity that doesn't have a negative stereotype relevant to the situation. So this is pretty consistent with, again, other mentoring advice. So if you've had an experience in which you felt very strong or powerful or competent or articulate, it can be very helpful to really bring that to mind, to kind of activate that truth about yourself, that identity. The main thing is just to take a moment to focus on that identity and to let that fill you, to take on that identity, which is your core strength identity, as opposed to a societally imposed deficit frame identity. Okay. And here's something that I found really helpful myself, and that's to remember that even if you're triggered, if you find yourself being de-skilled, you can bring yourself back. And another example that I've given before is interacting in a group of people trying to develop a cultural competence curriculum. And we were in small groups, and the group was being led by a surgeon. And at one point, he said to me, "You sound just like my wife," which, of course, you know, had its own purposes. But the interesting thing for me, you know, and I run a research program, I'm a full professor, I've done a lot, I became totally unable to speak or think. So I was aware that I had stereotype triggered in myself. So what I did at that time is I used some of these strategies, and I really focused on why am I there. I'm there because I really care about the patients who are being affected. I'm there because I care about making a contribution, and that brought me back. Did you want to provide an example as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that happens to me quite a bit. And for me, it's really focusing on the deep values and I'd say activating a different identity. I experience stereotype threat related to a few different things. One being working in an academic field and feeling not really coming from the same sort of socioeconomic background that a lot of people, that I at least perceive that a lot of people I work with do, and feeling sometimes a bit like an outsider because of that. And so really focusing on my values and activating identities that give me strength and make me feel powerful and competent is usually really a useful strategies for me.
Okay. And I guess the other piece is to just be aware it's stereotype threat. It's not your own ability. And there's some research showing, as I said before, that just that can create a positive effect. So sometimes when we do this in the context of a workshop, and we have people work in small groups. But what I would, obviously we can't do that, we're on a webinar, but what might be helpful to you is to think of a situation on your own later and reflecting back that you might have been experiencing stereotype or social identity threat. Think about what was the group identity, what was being triggered, what was the trigger or cue. And sometimes we don't know, because as I said, it can be, so for example, images on the wall or images in the setting that trigger the sense that maybe we don't belong, can trigger us without us really being aware that's what happened. But think about what might you do differently now in that same situation. Which of the strategies that we've talked about might have been helpful, if any? And we'd encourage you to do that on your own.
And sometimes it's not a single event, but a repeating situation, like a specific bi-weekly meeting where for some reason every time you find yourself, you're in that meeting, you find yourself kind of unable to articulate. You kind of feel like the quiet one, like you can't quite articulate the thoughts you're having or the ideas you're having, and it doesn't really reflect the way you behave in other meetings or elsewhere in your professional life. And so thinking about what kind of dynamics might be happening in that particular meeting or with the people who are in that meeting that might be triggering some kind of identity threat for you.
So Sean's going to talk some about how you might protect the people around you from social identity threat, or how bring them back if they're experiencing it.
Okay. There's a lot of overlap between this next section and the strategies that we've been talking about for protecting yourself. But I think there's some valuable strategies we could use, especially in a mentor-mentee relationship, or really any kind of interpersonal relationship where there is a kind of a power differential or between the people involved. They kind of fall loosely into three categories: interpersonal strategies, environmental cues, and then organizational procedures. So the corollary of the deep values affirmations that we talked about is to ask other people about their deep values. To facilitate self-affirmation, ask, especially mentees to think about or reflect on their deep values, maybe even write about them, to draw their attention to their successes and accomplishments, the things that they should be proud of, the values that define them. I know, thinking back to some mentoring relationships in my academic career, how valuable these kinds of things were. Some other things that you could do for mentees or other people who might be at risk of stereotype threat is to think ahead of time about how you might frame something in a way that doesn't invoke a stereotype. Think about what stereotypes or what identities might be at play, and how you might frame something in a way that avoids triggering that threat from that stereotype. When providing feedback, communicating high standards, but certainty that the person is capable of attaining them. A lot of these, without the language of social identity threat, they're really describing respectful, empowering communication. And for that second one, especially where it says the certainty person is capable of attaining them, I can remember times as a graduate student where my mentor's certainty that I was capable of attaining them was about the only thing I had. Like, she must know what she's talking about, so apparently I can't do it. Promote external or situational attribution for low performance. Those things aren't excuses. There are real reasons that people can sometimes underperform, and anxiety is one of them, and it's a real barrier for a lot of people, and it's not a personal failure. It's an external. It's a situational, something that you can attribute low performance to, and in reality is actually the reason for sometimes poor performance. And to subtly bring people back to successes that they've had, or any situation that really offers counter evidence to the stereotype that could be triggered.
I'm going to give another example of that. So I was interacting with a young woman, and she was tongue-tied, and just making herself more and more uncomfortable and miserable. And I didn't say why, but I said, just forget this a second. So tell me about yourself. What do you care about the most? What do you really, really care about? So she told me what she cared about, and then we came back, and she was fabulously articulate. And there was never anything in there that I said, this is because of stereotype threat. But it was just that moment of connecting with her core values that made her able to manifest her true abilities. So.
Mm-hmm. And connection. That's what this slide is really about, is finding when there is a a power difference or some kind of relationship that's not necessarily peer or even, is trying to find common ground and define your relationship in terms of that common ground. So you have a common in-group identity. Different identities, but those different identities kind of exist within a superordinal common identity that have common goals, common hopes, and common struggles. Perspective taking is a one very specific tool that we can use. Perspective taking is the cognitive component of empathy. It's been shown to inhibit the activation of unconscious stereotypes and prejudice. So it's something that we can do to avoid triggering threat in other people. And the slide is here. So to practice perspective taking, imagine yourself in their shoes, and if possible, check your perceptions. If I have their experiences, I'm in that person's shoes, how might I see what's happening? How might what was said have affected me if that was me? What might be valuable to me in this that conversation that might not have been so clear to me, without being in their shoes. Partnership building is an important, again, making a connection, building a sense of partnership, trying to create a common in-group identity. Another set of strategies is to protect and conserve mental resources. So we can be more present in interactions when we have mental resources, when we're not focusing on other things and relying on some of the stereotypes, the automatically available information to fill in gaps. So when we have a clear mind and the ability to devote energy and resources to connecting with another person, we can communicate better. And so things like mindfulness or using emotion regulation skills or emotion shifting exercises. Right. Michelle, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I do, because there's growing research, and there's something recently in healthcare about patient satisfaction, that our emotional states, the way that we feel and show our feelings, whether we want to or not, or whether we think we are or not, has a big impact on the other person, especially if we have any power or any higher status, so a professor, a mentor, a nurse, a physician. So part of this is for you. This will help you or me, but part of it is that it's very, very important when we're interacting with others to try to maintain at least a calm emotional state and ideally positive emotions. So we don't have time for this, but in some interventions we work on sort of very rapid emotion shifting exercises. So that might be something some of you would like to look up or learn more about or practice.
So this is the part that's thinking about the environment, assessing group processes, especially if you're in a position where you're, say, a leadership role. And in a meeting situation where there's multiple people there, to kind of sit back and observe how the group interacts with each other. Is there somebody who dominates the floor? Is there somebody who tends to interrupt or who is commonly interrupted? Whose ideas or opinions or thoughts get no response or follow-up, and how often that happens? How often those ideas are sort of repeated by somebody else and sort of co-opted and move forward in a different direction. And to observe those things and try to bring the conversation back around to those who might be interrupted or might have been ignored or might be experiencing the kind of threats that stand in the way of communicating our thoughts the way we'd like to. The learning and growth approach, we mentioned, Michelle mentioned a little bit when we were talking about the white racist stereotype threat, but it's proving in some recent research to be a really important way of being to
especially with
interracial
issues.
To take an approach that we are going to make mistakes, and there's things we don't know about each other, and that it's our both our responsibility and privilege to learn those things and to grow, and to not be afraid to call each other out. Sounds negative, but to
help each other.
Yeah, to help each other. I think it's probably the most difficult thing to try to enact, because it breaks the social norms in organizations a lot, where we sort of let things happen and go about our business. But I think the positive effects outweigh the momentary discomfort.
I have two personal examples of very welcome corrections. So in one case, someone pointed out that there was a person in meetings that I interrupted more than others, and that was really helpful to me to know that. But that's the learning and growth approach, because without that, I would have felt very defensive. And so some of what we need to do is be aware of the fact that we do not walk in each other's shoes. So, for example, as a white person, I cannot know what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes, but I need to learn, I need to know. And I can make mistakes based on my position without awareness, and I need people to tell me. And so some of what we're looking for in you, the people that we cannot see but wish we could, is to spread this learning and growth approach, right? So, for example, one of the things that I will often do is people will talk about women dominating, a woman or a couple of women dominating the conversation in a meeting, and there's research that shows that when women talk about half the time or a little less, they're perceived to be dominating because the conversation. So just saying, okay, well maybe, but maybe did you know about this? It's research, so maybe. And then I've also had other people in talks sort of point out ways that I'm saying things that might be hurtful, that might unintentionally be perpetuating stereotypes. And obviously, this is my area. This is what I do, all the time. And so I'm making mistakes. Everyone's going to make mistakes. So this is a big piece. If people can tell us and we can make it comfortable, it will help them reduce their experiences of stereotype threat, and it will help us know what to do and what we're doing that might be triggering stereotype threat, and what to do differently in the future.
So this is just another exercise. Again, if it was in person, something that we would do in more of a workshop kind of setting. But just if you have some time later to kind of think about the conversations or meetings you've had over the last month or two. Do you recall any times that another person's behavior, like you did before with your own behavior, performance or general response might have been affected by social identity threat? And given what you now know, is there anything that you would have done differently, or might in the future do differently? So now we're going to move into some of the environmental cues and organizational procedures, and this I think will be a little bit quicker, but some things that can trigger stereotype or identity threat are the environment around you, right? The images, the artwork, the educational materials, how people are presented, what magazines are available. Is anybody excluded by the physical space? Are chairs too small for some people? Is there not a place for somebody in a wheelchair or using some kind of walking aid to get through? And ask people representing different groups to conduct kind of an audit of the space. And it's not always quite obvious. I mean, I can tell going to school in a school of public health, there was a lot of physical activity and diet, clinical nutrition research going on, and these people, these researchers would sort of decorate their doors to their offices with images of young, thin people doing marathons and things like that, and there were things in some ways to aspire to and represented the things that they wanted their research to increase, move people towards. But to people who who maybe don't look like that. It also can signal that that those things are what's expected and what's normal, and what's and that things that don't quite match that don't belong. So here's some examples of images that
most common in waiting rooms.
Yeah.
These are the most common things shown in waiting rooms.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So they're white, they're young, they're right.
They're young, thin, attractive. There's groups that are not represented here.
One or two groups.
One or two groups. And so one thing that we can think about is promoting and exposing ourselves and the people who visit us in our offices and in our spaces to counter stereotypic images, or images that kind of challenge expectations of who should do what, or who would be most likely to do what. These are kind of run. These are the organizational things that you might focus on. So I'm just going to run through very quickly because I'd like to get to the question and answer part. Think about reducing evaluation criteria that depends on the feelings of the evaluators. Try to specify measurable outcomes and specific behaviors to make judgment less subjective and more objective. If possible, conduct evaluations in a way that allows the evaluators to be blind to employee group membership, so that people going into those situations don't feel that there's a possibility that they will be seen in terms of a group stereotype, that there is a kind of a level playing field, or where they can sort of be and whoever they choose to be in that moment, and not necessarily forced into a stereotype role. To disseminate and really focus on all-inclusive multicultural diversity philosophy, and importantly, to stay away from a colorblind philosophy. Organizations that emphasize a colorblind philosophy, that we don't see color, we don't see difference, tend to create situations that are less conducive to good performance than organizations that really acknowledge difference and celebrate it.
Yeah, colorblind philosophies have been shown to be connected with a higher rate of disparities or inequalities in a variety of settings. So the idea that that people are saying we're going to pretend that there is no such thing, that we don't see race, we don't see gender, is actually turns out to be very, very harmful. And in my opinion, it often ends up kind of translating, and this is my opinion, into everyone act like the white people. Mm-hmm. So it's important that organizations acknowledge the fact that there is variety and explicitly state it in a philosophy that is posted in multiple places. Okay.
All right. So that's the site that, again, where the references for the presentation can be found, and those are the general contact email addresses at Partners in Equity and Inclusion, and at our mayo.edu kind of scientific research email addresses. Did you want to?
No, just if you want to talk to us about intervention, contact us at, or talks, education. If you want to talk about scientific research, contact us at Mayo. But we are going to open this up for questions now.
So how do we do that?
See the questions. Okay. I'm going to ask our moderator, who has been perhaps collecting questions, to give us a little, how do we do it?
Yes, unfortunately, at present time, there are no questions. If you would like to ask our audience a few questions, we can absolutely open the floor to do so.
Okay. Ask the audience questions.
But are there any, first of all, are there any questions? Anything that anybody wants clarification on, or just thoughts about anything?
And actually, if not, could you jot down or let us know if you think this is relevant to you, if you believe you have personally ever experienced stereotype threat. We would like to know more about that. That would be very helpful.
Okay, one question just came in from Ms. Shana. Okay, I am a PhD student studying stereotype threat in nursing education. Are there any psychometric tools you would suggest?
That is a really good question. There are a few. Can you email us? And stereotype threat's an interesting phenomenon. We primarily know it by its effects. Mm-hmm. So it's a complicated question. But if you, did you say Shauna?
Shauna Curitan. She says, of course, I will email you.
Yeah, do that, because I think it's probably more complicated than we can get into. But there are some measures trying to get at that. So, and good for you.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, one more question. We have Miss Catherine Squires. When you say people need to communicate, why there has to be diversity rather than colorblind approach? Can you give examples of how people frame that shift?
Yeah, that is a good question. So the message is that we bring our variety of backgrounds, perspectives, selves, experiences to our common goal. So if we're talking about an educational organization, that we are bringing, and we may list a variety, but the problem with listing is you usually leave it out, but we are bringing all of our differences, and often you can have next to a huge list of the various ways, both cognitively, racial, ethnically, ability, size, health. I mean, there's just so many different ways that we differ. So that is the main message, that we are bringing we are welcome. Everybody is welcome to show up as their true selves from their set of experiences, and we're bringing it together to move forward our common goals. I hope that's helpful.
And also, I think acknowledging the difference in people's experiences. Right. I mean, to say that we don't see color, just kind of ignoring people's real experiencing of being treated differently. And so, moving to a language, acknowledge that people have different experiences, walk down the same hallways, and yet in very different worlds. What's the word I'm looking for? Gives I don't know, credence to how they're feeling. Validation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And actually, the other piece that can be helpful if you're kind of figuring this out for your organization is bringing in the evidence that things are changing fast, and organizations that can tolerate big differences and have a way for everyone to contribute fully from their true selves are doing better, much better, and are adapting and thriving. So that's I'm not super fond of this term, but that's the business case for it. In terms of the empowering case, it's making sure that everyone sees themselves. So some of what you need to do if you're going to develop this philosophy or write it up is give it to really everybody and ask if they see themselves in it. Do they feel included? And if not, how do you reword it?
Wonderful. One question here from Miss Lauren Crow. In an educational setting, what do you think is the best way to identify sources of stereotype threat in our materials, curriculum, department for social identities that are different than yours?
Yeah, well, some of what you might want to do is a bit of an audit. So one of the problems that we have in education is that the story is told, the history of everything is told from the point of view of the group in power, right? Because they're the people who are writing. And we don't want to throw out every single bit of research and history and evidence and everything that people have learned, right? That makes no sense. But we also need to bring that up to the surface. So there are cues about whose voice matters and who belongs. And sometimes in identifying the fact that so far a lot of the materials we're looking at might indicate that the only people who have anything to say, for example, might be white men, can subtly silence other groups, or white, basically whites, but white men and white women. So what I would encourage you to do is look for the audit that might subtly or not so subtly send that message. Name it. You don't need to throw out what was learned by these groups of people, and try to try to counter it, to try to bring up the discussion. So that would be one piece. The other thing is I would very much encourage you to look at artwork and sculptures for two things, and that's that environmental audit. So I would encourage you to bring in different groups to say, how comfortable do you feel in this environment? So there are two kinds of things with artwork. One has to do with who's represented in the artwork, and then the other one is whose culture produced the artwork. So whose culture, who looks at the artwork and says, oh yeah, that's super comfortable because that's my culture, and who looks at it and thinks, huh, that is not my culture, and then what are you going to do about it? The list of things is very long because we have a long way to go. Our environments are, I would say, very stereotype threat inducing.
The one thing that Michelle and I, as partners in equity and inclusion, have tried to do is to develop questionnaires that are specific to the institution to try to get at to try to get at people's experiences, especially, one side of that being the experiences of underrepresented minorities, the experiences of people who might be not represent the majority or dominant group. And when I say develop kind of institution specific, it's because that power difference kind of plays out in different ways by institution. And so it's, I think, important, and one of the things we try to do is really engage members of the stakeholders from different groups in the institution to really identify how power might be flowing out of a specific institution.
So I'm going to say a couple of things, and then we're going to build on what Sean just said, because we do that. We do climate assessments, deep climate assessments. But I will say to you that you do not, especially if you're a member of the group that's being excluded, you do not want to be the sole voice. So there is evidence that the diversity and inclusion officers in institutions often have their careers stalled. So some things you can do is make sure that you have people in power involved, and that you can bring in outsiders often to do these kinds of assessments. And I say this because I want to, if you're a student, I want to protect you. I want you to get your degree, I want you to go on, and I want you to contribute and help transform this world. What I don't want you to do is get caught up in needing to change the institution yourself. So bring in outside experts, put some pressure on your leadership to do that, to do some kinds of environmental audit. So we don't know who you are. This may not be appropriate, but if you are a student, if you are a postdoc, it's more important that you complete your work and get out there and do it than that you spend your time and energy right now correcting something that other people should be correcting.
Definitely. All right, we have time for one more question. Mohammed, how can we differentiate between bias and stereotyping?
Well, I mean, I wish I could talk with you directly, because we kind of want to know more about what you mean or what you're asking. Stereotyping is just over-applying a belief about a group to individuals in that group, and it can be positive or negative, right? A bias would refer to sort of having some kind of automatic reaction or response. And bias can, maybe are you talking about discrimination? We're guessing.
Oh, yeah, we're guessing. My best sort of guess at an answer would be that bias includes both the affective response and the content of the stereotype. And so the content of the stereotype is kind of half the story. If you're talking about the difference between bias and stereotype threat, then the relationship is that bias is one of the things that makes stereotype threat far more likely, because it can introduce that stereotyping into a situation, and stereotype threat is the way that bias affects the people who experience it.
Exactly. So we wouldn't experience stereotype threat if there wasn't genuine bias about our group, right? And so we're not at all arguing that the answer is all people who are experiencing discrimination and bias just need to deal with their stereotype threat. What we are saying is that given that there is bias and discrimination out there that can affect us whether in that exact situation that's going on or not, that understanding stereotype threat and being able to counter it in yourself and others is important. The other thing is it's not an even playing field, because some people can go into a situation with the expectation that their group is going to be seen as valuable and smart, and based on stereotypes, and other people are going into that situation with the awareness that their group has been devalued, which right away creates a very uneven playing field in that room. And that's something that we want people to be aware of, that these things create lasting effects regardless of whether anyone in that room is in fact biased, but also it will be exacerbated by the way that unconscious biases may be playing out in the conversation.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
That's great.
Any other questions?
Just wanted to contribute a final comment from Holly Hallman. Great webinar, thank you. It was difficult at times to hear the topics covered because they ring so true. Another aspect I would add is that there seems to be a career postdoc treatment view of scientists. I wonder if there may be an approach or technique to help with this as well. Oh.
Yeah. So one of the things that I don't like, and I try to create microclimates with greater or lesser success about our educational institutions, is for some reason they take really, really bright people who want to learn and give them the message that they don't have much to contribute. And I don't know if that's what you're talking about, Holly. And so like graduate students who, before they became graduate students, felt very competent and maybe had really high-powered jobs, or maybe they didn't, will suddenly start feeling lesser, right? And this is a problem this is a challenge as well for postdocs. I don't know what you mean by a career postdoc, because that sounds like it's a structural factor preventing people from getting a job. But what I will say is that postdocs may give presentations in a way that reflects a lower sense of their own competence than is actually accurate. And so it can manifest this sort of structural set of comments and expectations of students and postdocs can trigger stereotype threat in those groups and possibly you. And so hopefully some strategies here might help, because it's very environment specific. If you get outside of your own research institution, you are everyone will see you as the expert. You are the expert. And often postdocs know more than faculty about things because you're studying it more deeply and in a more recent way. I have no idea if we actually got to your point, Holly.
Yes, well, all of their email information is provided on the screen above, so please feel free to email any questions. I know we didn't get to everybody's, but we encourage you to reach out. And on that note, thank you very much, Dr. Michelle Van Ryn and Dr. Sean Fallon of Partners in Equity and Inclusion, and as well as the Mayo Clinic. Thank you very much for all of your hard work today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and all of this information will be posted on NRMN's YouTube page as well as our website. Thank you very much. Hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you. Goodbye.